Os justi meditabitur sapientiae, et linguae eius loquetur judicium. Next Deus in cordem sius. Non iremurare in alignantibus, neque inserare riser patientes iniquitatis. Gloria Patri et Filio et Spiritui Sancto, sicut erat in principio et nunc et semper, et in saecula saeculorum. Amen. Os justi meditabitur sapientiae, et linguae eius loquetur judicium. Et eius in cordem Justus ut pama florebit, sicut cedrus Libani. Multiplicabitur in domo Domini ad annunciandum misericordiam in veritatem per nocte Alleluia. Beatus vir qui suffert tentationem totus fuerit, accipiet coronam
The Feast of St. John of the Cross reminds us of our mystical life and origins. Indeed, by coincidence, the ferial readings speak of Elijah the prophet, who is seen to be present in some way in the mysterious figure of the forerunner, St. John the Baptist, of whom the readings of this period often speak. Elijah was a mystic of the Old Covenant, and the origin of the Carmelite Brotherhood is to be found already there, the famous School of Prophets. And according to an internal tradition in the Venerable Order of Mount Carmel, there was from time immemorial an awareness of the woman, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, to whom we used to sing way back in the days when the Carmelite house in Aberystwyth, where I lived in student days, was still open as a house of prayer and of study for the priesthood. Fros Carmeli was the end of the day, the flower of Carmel, the end of Compline, the second Marian chant which we would have to close the day in her arms, a reminder of that ancient family. For according to the internal awareness of the family, Elijah somehow knew it, and they refer to that strange cloud which after 3 years appeared when Gehazi was sent for the third time to see whether there was water or any sign of rain coming, and this little cloud came from the sea. The mountain is looking over that beautiful part of the Holy Land. Present Haifa is nearby. That would have been Jaffa. And there, this cloud, which would in some way contain the divinity, was a foreshadowing of our Blessed Lady, over whom the Holy Spirit would extend its wings, would overshadow her. Now, when it came eventually to forming a rule, it was the Patriarch of Jerusalem, Albert, St. Albert, who gave a very brief and essential rule, gospel-filled, not one preoccupied with details, but something going to the essence. A very early rule, which then has power still to form. And they were obliged, because of political reasons, to come to a more secure place and drifted towards the west, taking on the form of mendicant friars. Chaucer speaks of the orders four. Now, it may be a reference to the fact that there were 4 main rules. One was precisely the rule of St. Albert. One was the very early one of St. Augustine. Another was the one of St. Benedict, who used actually St. Augustine. We have some phrases coming directly from him, such as oratorium sit quod dicitur, let the oratory be what it is called, a sober reminder unto us that it should be the case. And the last would have been St. Francis, whereas St. Dominic, who lived at the same time as St. Francis, did not have a new rule, but they had their own constitutions, but followed the rule of what was already there in the canonical movement which influenced them, St. Dominic having been a canon of Osma in his early days, and possibly having got the white habit and certain other things from the Premonstratensian reform which was already around way before him. Whereas he took on therefore the rule of St. Augustine, which was that of the canons, St. Francis wrote his own, and it was the last to be taken as one of the major rules that could still be used when founding something new, by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, which limited henceforth the rules to those four. Hence it is that a very large number of, especially female congregations, have the rule of St. Augustine, which is very adaptable for their rule, to which they add their own constitutions. Now, with regard to the Carmelite family, this is their origin. And of course the female element becomes very important, even though initially it would have been a male movement of hermits there on Mount Carmel, looking back precisely to the school of prophets in some mysterious family way. Now, when it came then eventually to these ladies giving themselves in the same way to pure contemplation, it was a great benefit for the Church. There was a certain elasticity around at the time of Teresa of Avila, and the Lord wanted to address it. Now, we know that the Lord himself, was directly at the origin of this reform, and we see how providence and wisdom and power and grace all combined in the case of what happened at that point. For John of the Cross, moved by the Holy Spirit, wanted a very severe form of life and could see that things weren't perhaps as they might be in the Carmelite family in which he was formed. And out of reaction, he was on the point of seeking to be transferred to the Carthusian order, as we know, unchanged, Carthusia numquam reformata, quia numquam deformata. And at that point, by providence, he bumped into this great female Carmelite nun, somewhat older than he, and she invited him to come on board. Initially, it was not foreseen that there would be what would happen as time went on, a complete re-founding of a branch apart. We can see how his struggles to work within the order that he was actually brought up in did end to a certain dysfunctionality. Indeed, it ended in his imprisonment. And we see there again the way in which, strangely enough, rather like Joan of Arc, he did not feel obliged to remain in that prison and escaped. And in fact, one can see there where it happened, the place where he escaped, the wall. Of course, there's reference to it in his poetic writings, by night. He escapes. Now, Joan of Arc, St. Joan of Arc, she was also imprisoned in this tower, and strangely enough, it would seem against the counsel of her voices, St. Catherine, St. Margaret and so on, who used to give her indications of what to do. She jumped. She jumped. Could have been quite dangerous, very dangerous, but she got away hardly shaken, and off she went with herself. Little lassie though she was, strong, mulier fortis. So too in the case of John of the Cross, he did not in that context feel obliged by men to not do what he felt the Lord was asking him to do. And of course he was used. Now we see in this and all that develops, because we know quite well the story, because partly it was written by St. Teresa, the feminine side of things, in the book of Foundations. We see how precisely this element of fidelity on the interior corresponds to majesty and power and providence on the exterior level, and things come into play. A lesson unto us that when the Lord is the prime mover, we listen and also watch, because those two are always intertwined when God is truly at work. He makes things gently happen, and we have to be observant and not interfering with what he is already doing. We sometimes want to do things for the Lord, great things even, perhaps even found for the Lord, but it's our thing perhaps, and maybe all he wants is just our company at the altar. We may think that angels are useless also, and yet the higher ranks of angels, the cherubim and seraphim, are supremely useful, for they are gratuitous praise to the King of Glory. And that is the essence of the contemplative life. Any foundations is because the Lord wants more of it, but it must always be vertical. To go towards the exterior of doing things, even holy things, is to get in the way of all that the Lord is trying perhaps through us to do, because victimhood enters into it, very well understood by the great Carmelites of the centuries, including our own fairly recent Thérèse of Lisieux, victim to the merciful love. And what we see in common in the branches, that is male and female, that came out of the Reform, the Carmelite Reform, is that there is precisely this insistence on that gratuitous praise in the form of the prayer of regard, silent prayer, mental prayer, 1 hour in the morning and 1 hour in the evening, which actually means quite a lot of time in church, because the liturgy also is fairly complete, especially for the men. And if they're singing the office and the sacred mysteries, as well as the 2 hours of mental prayer, it means that their life is very much a life of gratuitous praise. The difference would be, of course, that in the case of the males, there is, as in the life of the Lord himself, this element of making available what is contemplated, what St. Thomas Aquinas refers to when he speaks of contemplari, to contemplate, et contemplata aliis tradere, and to hand on the things contemplated unto others, indicating that it is superior to give light than merely to be a light, that is, to give warmth and light to others as well as just being a light oneself for the Lord. So there is that element of imitating the fullness of the Lord's life, what one abbot, the abbot of Aberbode, a great Premonstratensian abbot some years ago, called the life of the Totus Christus, the Christus Totus, the whole Christ, that is, the life of all the elements of the Lord, whereas the female would be essentially that of the Lord on the mountain. The male of the Carmelite family would also include that of the Lord in the day. He went about doing good, but always anchored in the other. We have actually a Carmelite bishop in Ireland, and it is interesting that these often make very good men also on the pastoral level, precisely because they are listening first. And one who is listening to God listens well also to souls. One word on the spirituality of this great saint. It is based on faith, and John Paul II, soon to be St. John Paul II, did his doctoral thesis on St. John of the Cross, actually in the university where I was, and he came back to us one day to speak to us, and they named the aula where he spoke after him ever since. But he, of course he was writing it in Latin, he went into some depth the whole notion of faith, doctor in the faith, is what actually in book form his thesis comes out as, is something which invites us to see what St. John of the Cross was trying to say. Now, in a few words, it goes something in this direction. As in the case of the senses, the five senses, there is a distance and a purification taking place in the case of the soul who is being purified and set apart to see God. So in the very spiritual senses, which correspond exactly to the five physical senses, there is something similar taking place. And it can lead to apparently a lack of knowledge and understanding, a darkness and an emptiness, a night, which is the essential liberation, for then we do not exist in our own right. The soul at that point is free because he has no right or understanding or presupposition or taste even. The soul abdicates and ceases, as it were, to be, and then can fly and be free alone for that for which it is made, contemplating the Almighty, who cannot get through as long as there is still some attachment to itself, and even to things appertaining to God, but not God himself. A lesson forever unto us, that we can mess up our interiority by too much insisting on things for the Lord, which aren't the Lord himself, when the Lord actually wants essentially that contemplation, and from there he can do the rest more freely. There is in the body, the corpus of writings of St. John of the Cross, much poetic, much mystical material, but there is one volume which is often overlooked, and it is the most accessible and often in some concrete ways the most useful. It is the Maxims, a short volume which contains just a series of gems of common sense, glimpses of common sense. And just to take one amongst many this morning, we can look at one and see why it is important. It is this one. Amongst the obstacles to the interior life, he picks up this one in particular. It is the radical incompatibility between being a great talker and being a contemplative. Now, do we see why? A great talker is living outside his soul, and his soul is passing through his mouth to the ambience around him. The silent person is keeping his energy and orientating his interior in a different direction. Now, this is very important. The difficulty for Carmelite friars and nuns is sometimes the fact that there is inbuilt in their day the obligation of recreation, and that can be a point at which much of that energy is actually lost. The advantage of the specifically Cistercian, Trappist, Benedictine life following that rule of perpetual silence, that would be actually the difference between the Trappist and the Benedictine interpretation of the rule, that there would not be a moment of recreation in the Trappist timetable at all, is that the way in which the whole of the monastic life takes away from the need for a moment of recreation, which might be more necessary in a very small house, as the nuns sometimes have, enclosed. You have to kind of let off steam, a safety valve, something to bring it down a bit, because after all the head has to be kept in balance. That is done by the manual work in the Trappist life, and therefore there is no point at which the mouth is obliged to be open. I remember the reflection of the novice master way back in the 70s at La Trappe, referring to the situation there at La Trappe. Il y en a qui sont tout à fait muets. There are some in community who are completely dumb. That is, never open their mouth. They just use the signs. But whatever the situation was, we were not to be communicating except with the person in charge of the work for an immediate reason to do with the work. That was quite clear. So that therefore there was the whole protection, all the pores of the interior were protected. So the energy was going towards God, and the tongue was consecrated unto praise. Now these things are to be remembered, because there are reforms and reforms and reforms of reforms all around the Church and in her history. And even in our day, the same Holy Spirit is asking for reform in the form right now of this spirit of returning to the essence of the gospel, which is given to us by our Pope, who has taken precisely the name of Francis, the man closest to the heart of Jesus.
Veritas mea et misericordia mea cum ipso et in nomine meum exaltabitur cornu eius. Quibus venire post me abnegensem et ipsum et ad crucem suam et sequatur amen. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom.